Hello, everyone. It's good to see so many familiar faces and friendly faces. I'm particularly honored to have Madam Minister here, other ministers, deputy ministers, members of the AmCham. Ara, thank you for those nice opening words. Distinguished guests, and of course fellow members of my embassy team that are here. I'm very, very pleased to see so many smiling, friendly faces from the embassy here. Before I start, I should not let an anniversary pass without comment, a very important anniversary. It was 25 years ago this week, February 3rd, 1992, that the U.S. Embassy opened its first diplomatic mission in the new Republic of Armenia. We were also the first diplomatic mission to open in Armenia. Many of you will remember we were at the Harazdan Hotel. As you can see, we've upgraded our surroundings a bit. But I think it's a very important symbol of the commitment the United States has made to Armenia and the value the United States puts on our relationship with Armenia, that here we are, 25 years later, and I'm addressing an American chamber that is so active and so engaged. It is becoming a very pleasant tradition for me to deliver a major policy speech to the American chamber, a tradition that reflects the strong partnership the embassy enjoys with the chamber, and it also demonstrates the deep respect and appreciation that I and the embassy have for the work the chamber does in furthering U.S.-American commercial ties. As all of you know, as Ara indicated, I gave my first major policy speech as ambassador before the chamber and distinguished guests from the government back in November 2015. In the speech, I outlined four priorities. Four priorities I had set for myself and for the embassy over the tenure of my time as ambassador. I announced these four priority areas 15 months ago because I wanted to be transparent. I wanted to be transparent with the Armenian government, with the Armenian people. I pledged to share the efforts my embassy would undertake to achieve these goals, these priorities, and over time, my assessment of how much impact the embassy's efforts were having. What I want to do today in my time with all of you is assess the quality and the impact of the efforts the embassy undertook to promote each of these four priorities, and to offer some thoughts about the next steps as we look forward to continue working to advance these four priorities in partnership with the Armenian people, Armenian civil society, and Armenian government. When I think back on the past 15 months, the period between my first speech at the chamber and today, it is a little sobering to realize that in that relatively short space of time, all of us have witnessed events that changed Armenia's political and economic landscape, as well as demonstrated how this country can be so resilient in the face of tragedy. Everything from the constitutional referendum in 1915 to the tragic loss of life when the Erebuni police station was seized, to the April War. During those 15 months, and certainly in the tragic aftermath of the war last April, I also realized how much the lack of a peaceful resolution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict directly hampers the efforts all of us are making to move Armenia forward and for the embassy to achieve its goals. The lack of a resolution, a peaceful resolution to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, for example, I think we have to be realistic, fuels corruption, because it keeps Armenia's borders closed. And when borders are closed, it's easier for very powerful economic forces and individuals to manipulate markets, to control competition. That's just one example of how the failure to come to a resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is holding back the great potential Armenia has. So let me preface the rest of my speech by underscoring that though we have these 4 priorities, it remains a continuing priority, a continuing importance for the embassy, for the U.S. government, and for me personally, working with the new Minsk co-chair, Ambassador Hoagland, to give time and effort to work to achieve a peaceful settlement for Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, let me turn to my 4 priority areas, and the questions I'd like to address today are 2. Where do we stand a year later on each of these priorities, and what additional steps could be taken to move forward? While the embassy's priorities are all long-term goals, and achieving dramatic change is not to be expected in the course of a year, I think we should be able to see some signs of change that we could use to measure the course we've taken and identify what progress we may be making, or where we're not making progress. Now, those of you may remember my first priority has been to deepen the business and trade relations between our 2 countries, as part of an overall focus on boosting Armenia's prospects for economic growth and job creation. And I think this is the area where arguably the U.S. Embassy has seen the most progress, and we are hopeful that many of the seeds we've planted over the last year will bear fruit in the not too distant future. In keeping with that agricultural metaphor, let me mention first that over the last year, we've made a significant and ongoing contribution to Armenia's agricultural development. Over the past 2 years, the USAID mission here has assessed this is a sector, agriculture, with significant economic and job potential, as well as the most effective way to prevent the migration of Armenians out of their villages. And so that justified an allocation of new resources and a new focus on this sector over the last year or so. So, what have we done? USAID helped establish 6 new farm and veterinarian service centers where local farmers can learn best practices and how to develop a farm business, how to do animal breeding. USAID also provided direct support to Armenian agricultural producers by supporting their participation in local and international trade expos and festivals. We help to establish rural agricultural cooperatives that can boost local economies and create jobs. Thanks to these activities in the past year alone, the embassy calculates 41 new Armenian businesses have been established in rural areas. An additional 41 startups have received additional new financing from USAID, and over 650 jobs, temporary and permanent, in rural villages have been created. Also, to encourage economic growth, the embassy's pursued several initiatives in the fields of entrepreneurship and STEM, which I know this audience knows well aware stands for science, technology, engineering, and math, areas where Armenia has a real competitive advantage and a very impressive capital resource in its people. For example, USAID announced last year that it is partnering with IBM, Yerevan State University, and the government of Armenia to establish the Innovation, Solutions, and Technologies Center, or ISTC, which will connect top U.S. technology universities with 9 Armenian universities to develop IT workforce skills to improve the capabilities of young Armenians to work in the growing IT sector. Another example of what we've done to promote economic growth, with the support of a very generous Armenian-American family, the Hovnanian family, well known to many here, the embassy established last year the brand new Fulbright Hovnanian program for top achieving Armenian students who want to earn a master's degree in entrepreneurship or one of these STEM fields by studying in the United States and then returning to Armenia to put to work in the Armenian economy the knowledge that they gained from this scholarship and their opportunity to study at one of the best universities in the United States. Since the primary focus of my economic priority was the deepening of direct business ties between the U.S. and Armenia, I want to address that issue as well, in addition to what we've done to promote economic growth. And I'm delighted to report that we've made considerable progress, I think, this past year. But more can be done. In terms of investment, as many of you in this room know, Contour Global, a U.S. firm, completed the acquisition of the assets of the Vorotan hydroelectric facility in 2016. And now that represents the largest single U.S. investment, private investment, in Armenia's history. And it is the first U.S. investment in Armenia's very important and growing energy sector. In addition, Contour Global has told us it plans to invest more than $70 million over the next several years and create about 150 new near-term jobs. Meanwhile, another U.S.-affiliated firm, Lydian International, started the construction of its Amulsar mining project in 2016. By 2018, Amulsar will likely represent the largest U.S. equity investment in Armenia, with construction costs estimated at $370 million from 2016 to 2018. And during the peak construction phase at the mine, up to 1,300 jobs will be secured, according to Amulsar, while 700 people will be employed directly by Lydia in Armenia during the 10 years that the mine is in operation. I acknowledge there are always concerns about a major mining project, but I'm happy to report, in terms of in the environment, that in a first for Armenia and first for the mining operations here, Amulsar's environmental and social impact assessment of the impact this mine would have on the surrounding environment has been deemed fully compliant with standards set by the World Bank and by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Altogether, this new investment from Contour Global and Lydian will amount to about $500 million US over the next 2 to 3 years. Both companies, joined by others in this room, from Coca-Cola to Synopsys, have also been high-profile models of the concept of corporate social responsibility, which Ara mentioned. In their respective interactions with the local communities where they're working, they have encouraged other Armenian companies, I believe, to see the value of corporate social responsibility, the importance of ensuring that the community where a firm is located also prospers in direct social ways. And I applaud all the firms, all the companies in this room that have engaged in corporate social responsibility. You represent the best face of American business practice. To attract more diversified investment and business linkages, the embassy also organized, I think, several well-received commercial events over the last year. I won't run through all of them. Just one example, 2 months ago in November, we partnered with 2 government ministries and with our friends at HSBC Bank to hold a sustainable mining business conference. A mining business conference that connected 35 Armenian mine operators with 7 leading U.S. companies. In total, throughout 2016, the U.S. Embassy organized commercial events and activities that brought 20 U.S. companies to Armenia to meet with Armenian firms, and most of those 20 are represented in the Fortune 500 businesses list. They included brands such as General Electric, Honeywell, Caterpillar, IBM, Dow, Oshkosh, and Open Systems International. All participated in the events we organized. This is all to the good, I think. Much of our work in creating new business connections between U.S. and Armenian entrepreneurs and businesses was given a bit of new stimulus in the wake of the first meeting of the U.S.-Armenian Council on Trade and Investment. in November of 2015, right after I gave my last speech, which Ara referred to. The TIFA was signed and established by our two countries to promote bilateral trade and investment. The TIFA Council met in November and created 8 working groups that have been formed in such areas as intellectual property rights, fair government procurement, customs, areas that are important to trade. And the idea is that by creating these working groups, we've provided a platform, a regular platform for U.S. and Armenian technical experts to identify issues that block trade, make it hard to invest in each other's countries, and address those obstacles so that our business ties can deepen further. The U.S. government, U.S. Embassy is committed to continue to work with our partners in the Armenian government to expand trade opportunities between the U.S. and Armenia, and we want TIFA, the TIFA Council, and its 8 working groups to be successful. But to maximally make those working groups effective, achieve the increased trade that we want, and I know the Armenian government wants, the TIFA Council, frankly, needs to be more active. The working groups need to be more active. Business forums are all very good, but we must hold the TIFA working groups, which have Armenian and U.S. government officials on them, hold them to account and ensure that they really tackle the existing and the very persistent barriers to trade and investment. If you or your companies are facing barriers to trade, tell us. The TIFA and the TIFA Council only works when it is business-driven. Believe me, you don't want a bunch of bureaucrats driving the agenda for the councils. One area, as I look at what we've achieved, that I would encourage the Armenian government to look at is to be more active in customs, because the simplified and transparent implementation of customs procedures is necessary for Armenia to expand trade with the rest of the world. Although I recognize that Armenia has to harmonize its customs and other trade facilitation procedures to conform to the regulations of the Eurasian Economic Union, I encourage the Armenian government not to lose sight of its continuing obligations with regard to the World Trade Organization and its other international trading partners. If I may respectfully suggest one recommendation to the Armenian government, it's that it further review its use of reference pricing and its classification procedures for goods imported from abroad, as these can create real barriers to large-scale international trade, and they can negatively impact Armenian consumers. I'd now like to turn to what was my second priority, the embassy's second focus, partnering with Armenians to fight corruption. We've seen some positive outcomes, but much remains to be done. I'm pleased and very encouraged by the fact that Prime Minister Karapetyan and his team have made the fight against corruption a priority in all their public remarks. And I've been heartened to see more Armenians speaking openly about how corruption affects them and their ability to live their lives and conduct their businesses. One area where we have seen significant progress, and for which I wish to strongly commend the Armenian government, is in its commitment to have Armenia join the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or what we call ETI, E-I-T-I. ETI membership requires that a government, civil society, and the mining industry come together to foster greater transparency and clean, responsible, sustainable mining development. The Armenian government, with support from the USAID mission here, has worked hard on a candidacy package. It has formed a multi-stakeholder working group with representatives from the companies, from civil society, and from various international partners. And it has formally submitted its membership application to the board of ETI just last month. Joining ETI if the membership is approved by the membership, is not an end in itself, but it is a significant commitment by the government, which I applaud, to increase transparency and to uphold international standards in the all-important mining sector in this country. Over the past year, the embassy has done other things to support the fight against corruption. We partnered with the government and civil society on a number of anti-corruption initiatives. Just to name a few, for instance, we have supported programs by local media to develop their investigative journalism skills, which I think helps the media fulfill its crucial democratic function of holding the government and holding public figures, even myself when I park in the wrong place, accountable, and of keeping Armenian citizens informed. In another example, a USAID-funded anti-corruption project has identified corruption risks in the healthcare sector and has developed 55 recommendations, many of which, if they were implemented, would bring real benefits to Armenians and their ability to access the health system. And those 55 recommendations have been submitted to the Ministry of Health for its consideration. While the link between corruption and economic development, and I think the link between corruption and the rule of law, have always been apparent, recently I've been, to be honest, quite pleased to see more discussion in Armenia about how our corruption can impact and threaten national security. When I mentioned the intersection between corruption and national security in my speech to the AmCham 15 months ago, I think many people were surprised. Many people were dismissive. I don't claim credit at all, but I think this issue of how corruption can affect the security of a state is now being frankly addressed in Armenian political debates, and there are some proposals for serious action from the government. Certainly, the public discourse here, during and after the four-day war in April, highlighted the corrosive effect corruption can have on national security. And I think it brought the issue into public spotlight. And the embassy stands ready to continue and help that discussion move forward. Ultimately, however, as we all know in this room, the only way to achieve meaningful progress in the fight against corruption is for the government to demonstrate its own political will. The government must strengthen and empower public institutions at all levels, and the government must send a clear message from on high that corruption will not be tolerated and that no one, regardless of their political standing or their economic wealth, is above the law. Absent this message, no truly transformative change can occur. Encouraged by the Prime Minister's public commitment to tackle corruption, I'd like to close by offering two specific suggestions for the government to consider, suggestions that have become apparent to us over the last year as we worked at the embassy on this issue. First, I suggest that the government strengthen the independent role and the responsibilities of the Ethics Commission on high-ranking officials. I applaud the government's recent step in this direction. As most of you know, there were significant changes made to the Administrative Violations Code and the Criminal Code that provide now for fines, criminal sentences, and limitations on holding government positions for up to 3 years for individuals who submit false income declarations. But more needs to be done. One fix would be for the government to make clear that the launching of an investigation into any possible corrupt activities by a government official, whether that's an ambassador or a minister or a tax collector, does not require specific evidence of an actual bribe paid or a favor given. But an investigation could be triggered by a prosecutor's assessment that the assets declared by a government official are so great as to trigger reasonable grounds of suspicion. I'm very impressed that Armenian media does a very good job of analyzing the ethics declarations and identifying instances where officials maybe have declared assets that are 40, 50, 100 times greater than their government salaries. but there was no indication of follow-up from the government. A second suggestion I would make in this area, I respectfully suggest that the government consider establishing a fully independent anti-corruption body that can both investigate and prosecute cases. This was a specific recommendation by Mr. Peter Ainsworth, who was a senior anti-corruption counsel at the United States Department of Justice, who came out to Armenia with the support of the embassy twice last year for consultations. I'm happy to discuss with the government how we might work to support if the government chooses to consider creating such an independent body. I think this seems a good time for the government to consider this suggestion, because I understand the Prime Minister is currently deciding how to restructure the existing Anti-Corruption Council and how to formalize the connections and the lines of authority between the Anti-Corruption Council and other government bodies that work on anti-corruption. I'm going to stop here to take a minute and address an anti-corruption action that the embassy undertook in 2015 and that I know has been controversial to many in Armenia. That is our decision to provide USAID funded support to the work of the Anti-Corruption Council. There was some criticism 2 years ago. In response, I said repeatedly, including when I spoke to the Chamber in November 2015, that we are willing to work with any Armenian governmental institution that demonstrates a commitment to fighting corruption, but that at the same time, our continued support for the Council was contingent on the achievement of measurable results. The Anti-Corruption Council has not demonstrated as much progress as we had hoped. And because of that, we only dispersed about 2.5% of the money that we allocated for its support. I hope this fact will assuage the suspicions of the many people who I think speculated that somehow the embassy had delivered the entire sum of money to the Council in an unmarked briefcase. We're the U.S. government. We're not James Bond. We have shared with the Prime Minister our need to see concrete progress from the Council, and I know he agrees, and I know he wants to reshape the Council and its work as well. Based on the outcome of those discussions, we will decide on our next steps, including whether to continue to support the Council or redirect the funds that we have not released to a different anti-corruption mechanism if the government can identify one. Let me turn to our third priority, the strengthening of democratic institutions, human rights, and civil society here in Armenia. We've been deeply engaged on multiple fronts in this area. There's been some progress and notable success stories, which give reason for hope about how democracy is taking deep root here. But I have to be honest, I've also witnessed some troubling trends in the areas of human rights and rule of law that I need to talk about. First, let me mention some of Armenia's very laudable successes in this area. One of the most important is the fact that Armenia retained its status as a Tier 1 country in the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report for the 4th straight year in a row, thanks in large part to the Armenian government's interagency working group, which is a model, I think, of cooperation between a government and civil society. But I have to say, if the efforts the government is making to prevent trafficking in persons are going to continue to be recognized, to continue to be among the best in the world, the government needs to reinstate a labor inspectorate without delay. Without a functioning labor inspectorate, it is very difficult to track and prevent trafficking in labor, especially child labor. Another very important, I think, win for Armenia and for civil society here and the embassy's support was the Armenian government passing 2 weeks ago the law on public organizations, which is a complete game changer for NGOs, for civil society in this country. It will allow them to pursue greater financial independence, have their own businesses, and it'll make them more long-term sustainable. Let me also say that in the area of human rights, I was greatly encouraged by the initiative of the Ministry of Defense to establish a Center for Human Rights and for Building Integrity in the Military, which the U.S. Embassy has helped, as well as by recent reports that the ministry has created a hotline for parents to call if they have questions or concerns about their son's treatment in the military. I know that's an issue that affects every Armenian family, and I applaud the ministry for this commitment to more transparency and human rights. I would also mention that thanks to small grants from the embassy, several Armenian NGOs were able to implement projects that made a real difference in everything from helping the disabled to campaigning against sex-selective abortions. What all these successes tell me is that there are many organizations, many people in Armenian government and Armenian civil society that care deeply about human rights and rule of law and are dedicated to making sure that they take deep root here in Armenia. But as I also said, we've witnessed some troubling trends over the past 15 months that give me and give the embassy cause for some concern. With regard to the constitutional referendum of December 2015, the embassy was deeply concerned by the credible allegations of electoral fraud that came from nonpartisan observers, from media, and from civil society. Shortly after the referendum took place, the embassy issued a public statement calling on the government to transparently investigate every case where there was credible evidence of electoral fraud and to prosecute individuals to the fullest extent of the law who were suspected of participating in such fraud. Following the referendum, the embassy put down a clear marker, publicly announcing that we would draw upon the information that's contained in public reports or in the media to determine whether individuals who directly interfered in the integrity of the referendum process would be ineligible to participate in embassy-sponsored programs or activities. And although I cannot share information about the individuals who have been affected by this decision out of respect for their privacy, I can assure you that we have followed through on our pledge. Following the constitutional referendum, I very much welcomed President Sargsyan's public commitment to address the public's lack of trust in the electoral process. I agree with the President's characterization that the upcoming elections in April will shape the future of Armenia. It is crucial, as the President said, that they be free and they be fair, and that the Armenian people have confidence in the results of the April elections. To help make the Armenian government's public commitment to credible elections a reality, the U.S. Embassy and USAID, in partnership with our friends at the EU and the UK, Germany, and the UN mission to Armenia above all, have provided financial support for new voting processes and for new electoral equipment that was agreed upon by the government, the political opposition, and civil society last year. Unprecedented agreement that required compromise on all sides. These measures will make possible same-day voter authentication, as well as the publication of signed voter lists after the elections, which has always been an important demand of the opposition here. But let me be clear, these additional measures cannot, by themselves, guarantee free and fair elections. They can make April's electoral process more transparent. They can make it more costly to commit fraud. But the elections will be free and fair only if the government demonstrates the political will to make them so, and if the political opposition and Armenian civil society act responsibly to safeguard the process. The burden is on the government and on its institutions, the Central Election Commission, the enforcement bodies, the judiciary, to take the actions that are needed to foster a climate in which the Armenian people can freely express their will at the voting booth. At the same time, a free and fair election also requires responsible civic engagement in the election process from the political opposition and from civil society, which is why we were glad to see them work with the government last year on this agreement, and we hope that that spirit of positive and constructive collaboration will continue throughout the electoral period and beyond. Armenia's future depends on it. For a free and a fair election to take place, the government must also create a climate in which media and civil society are free, independent, and unrestricted. We have recently heard at the embassy intimations, reports of increased pressure on media and civil society that seems designed to constrain their freedom of expression and redirect critical editorial views in advance of the parliamentary elections this spring. If true, this would be very worrying and would further erode Armenia's standing in reports issued by international organizations on press freedom worldwide. I do take the government at its word that it intends to conduct free and fair elections, just as we take the opposition parties and civil society at their word that they intend to play a constructive role in the process. This is something we'll be watching very closely over the next few months. Let me quickly now address the events of Erebuni last July. During much of the 15-day standoff, Armenia's law enforcement struck a good balance in terms of securing Armenian safety and security around an active site of crime, while defending Armenians' right to peacefully protest. However, I and the embassy were deeply concerned by the credible reports of excessive use of force that were reported the night of July 29th and 30th by the police against unarmed protesters and against journalists. We made our concerns clear at that time, noting that such actions violated press freedom and the right of Armenian citizens to the freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And although some police officers have been punished for their actions on that day and that night of July 29th, 30th, more could and should have been done in this regard. Serious crimes occurred the evening of July 29th and 30th, and it is important that those responsible be held to account. Another area of concern which the fallout of Erebuni highlighted has been the government's use of pretrial detention. Let me just say that while it's true pretrial detention is used in legal systems around the world, including in the United States, it should be a last resort, employed only when there are no other feasible alternatives to ensure that a suspect won't flee or interfere with an ongoing investigation. It should never be used as a punitive tool. I will be frank that in the case of Erebuni and other politically sensitive cases this year, I am concerned by the pretrial detentions of several defendants who participated in the demonstrations or are suspected of giving nonviolent support to the militants who seized the police station and caused the tragic deaths of 3 policemen, but they were not involved in the actual armed seizure or in the deaths of the policemen. Let me be clear, my intention in mentioning these cases is not to prejudge these individuals' guilt or their innocence for the crimes they are charged with, but to emphasize that each pretrial detention must be based on a strong, fully transparent legal rationale, and the burden is on the government to make these rationales evident, or to proceed to an open trial as quickly as possible. So there's no appearance that people are being held in pretrial detention to prevent them from speaking out. With that, I'll quickly move to our 4th priority, which was doing a better job of explaining U.S. foreign policy to Armenian audiences. You may recall I identified this as a priority because many of the Armenians with whom I meet, even some people who have visited or lived in the United States, have told us they do not understand U.S. policies around the world. This is a challenging battle in a lot of ways, given the reality of the media environment here in Armenia. I know that Armenians have limited exposure to U.S. and Western news sources, and even though the internet penetration in this country is increasing every year, facilitating access to U.S. media outlets, many Armenians lack the English skills to take advantage of that. So what we've done is we've increased our outreach. I've spoken to groups such as yours at several universities. My staff at the embassy have partnered with alumni to talk about various foreign policy issues at our American corners across Armenia. I've done a number of interviews, live Facebook chats, and we have a strong and active presence on Facebook and Twitter to talk about everything, from climate change to the Ukraine, to why the United States is concerned about what's happening in the Arctic. I'd be interested in hearing what your thoughts are, how you think we're doing, how we can do better. If you think expanding the understanding of U.S. actions around the world is a worthwhile goal, I'd encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Comment on our posts, share them with your contacts. To sum it up, I'm proud of the efforts the embassy's undertaken in the last 15 months to advance these 4 priority areas. I think our decision to focus on 4 areas was very beneficial. It allowed the embassy to concentrate our various tools and all our resources and challenged me and my staff to design some creative and complementary programs that can make a difference to areas that impact everyday Armenians every single day. I believe we helped create jobs, we helped bring some new investment, we started conversations between U.S. and Armenian businesses, and we brought American experts to Armenia to talk with Armenian government officials and civil society and everything from anti-corruption to how you protect the rights of the disabled. As we move forward, however, I'm very much aware there's room for improvement for us, more that we can do. I'm coming to the end of a long speech, but before I conclude, I want to mention that with a new U.S. president in office, a new boss for me and all my colleagues at the embassy, this is obviously a time of transition, a time of change. And with change comes opportunities. I can tell you that whenever we have a new U.S. administration in Washington, the new team on board back in Washington has lots of questions. And it is our job at the U.S. Embassy here in Armenia to provide the members of the new administration with background and information. And we will be doing that. We will be explaining to the new administration so they can understand and appreciate the contours, the nuances of the U.S.-Armenian relationship, the importance of the U.S. interests in this part of the world, and why the depth of friendship between the United States and Armenia is so valuable to the United States, and why it must only be deepened and strengthened. I thank you for your attention, your interest, and your friendship. I look forward to speaking with many of you personally as we go out for the second half of the evening. Let me say once more, thank you to the Chamber for your hospitality, your generosity, Ara, in hosting tonight's event. And again, thank you, everyone in this room, everything you do every day to help Armenia achieve its potential.